Did you ever want to be a fireman? Don't worry, nobody is looking. As a kid, did you ever want to be a fireman? You ever start making siren sounds when you're alone? Firefighter? Why? Cool uniforms? The trucks? Chicks dig firemen? Little danger and you like to believe you're a thrill seeker daredevil? At least when I was growing up, it was pretty normal for a boy to want to be a fireman. And you probably had a whole bunch of Tonka toy fire engines, battery-operated fire engines. The fireman had the whole enchilada. It was actually a pretty normal thing for a boy. But did you ever notice that in spite of the fascination with fire that we've had since the caveman time, which actually took a little while for them to find, that you had toasting marshmallows at summer camp around the campfire, maybe playing with matches and firecrackers and setting off pop rockets. When it came to movies about fire, there really isn't a long list. So you have some scenes with special effects with fire, but a movie just about fire is pretty much that rara avis, that rare bird. And back in the 70s, when I was growing up, when blockbuster disaster films became the big thing, I could count the movies about fire on only one finger. Irwin Allen's The Towering Inferno, where we actually got to feel the drama for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, to imagine what it must have been like in the Twin Towers about 30 years later. But after that, almost 2 decades passed before Ron Howard came out with Backdraft. Remember Backdraft? And that was more about firefighters and a whole bunch of fires caused by an arsonist. But for this video, Backdraft is probably the better movie because remember the Robert De Niro and Stephen Baldwin characters? We all remember the Donald Sutherland burn it all dude. But De Niro and Baldwin were the guys sent in after the fire to determine exactly how the fire started. And I wanted you to remember this image as you think about a pandemic. In fact, if you remember Baldwin, he started off as a firefighter going in to save lives and fight fires, but he came out with a dummy and they figured that probably wasn't a good job for him, so he could just come back after the fire and try to figure out how it got started. Kind of freaked out, got, I don't know, messed up. When you were in school, maybe you became a junior fire marshal yourself. Got the little card, learned the junior firefighter song. But even if you missed that at your grammar school, everyone had to experience the fire drill, right? Line up, single file, proceed in an orderly manner out of the building, probably down the fireproof steps, maybe not the fire escape, out the door and off to some designated location safe and away from the school building, right? Somebody was probably assigned to turn off the lights and shut the door, but it was pretty much planned that you were not going to go off, become Superman, try to save anyone, or try to fight the fire yourself. Grab the fire extinguisher and be Captain Fireman. Your job in a burning building was what? Save yourself, get out, and let the professionals do the real work, right? And even when the firefighters came, what was their job? Try to determine the cause of the fire? No, the building is burning. People may need help. Finding the cause of the fire is one of the tasks that assumes the lower priority because of more urgent problems in the present moment. But still, the fire is raging. But still, eventually, somebody has to go back to examine the ruins. The Robert De Niro and Stephen Baldwin types who bring dummies out when the fire is burning. Maybe still smoking embers and debris, examining different things that are left around, evidence, to try to figure out exactly how the fire got started, right? And it should be pretty clear that to prevent future fires, this is a pretty important step towards prevention. And it should be common sense that at that point, they are not concerned about all the damage and the destruction, the casualties, the fatality counts. The news cameras are no longer in their face. All the excitement is gone. But only and exclusively what event or chain of events set off the whole thing, right? Very, very clinical. So imagine a pandemic pathogen. Oh, the detective word. So imagine a pandemic pathogen that's spread all over the world. Big fire. Conflagration. And if you need to think about a movie to get your head in the game, think about Outbreak with Cuba Gooding, Gus Hoffman, Rene Russo, and Patrick Dempsey. Think about Contagion with Gwyneth Paltrow, Matt Damon, Lawrence Fishburne, and Jude Law. Think about 12 Monkeys with Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt. Are they concerned about the body counts, the hospitalizations, the rising infections? No. They are focused. Remember that scene? Focus upon what? The origins. Or how exactly the outbreak began, the detective work. Because this initial event informs them about how to prevent the spread and get the rampant pathogen under control. Remember, Bruce Willis, he was going back to the past to find out how this whole thing started. And one common sense reason for going all the way back to the beginning is very much like the problems of overwhelm that many state health directors encountered by attempting to begin tracer contact follow-up way after the pandemic arrived in May and June. After infections were already racing out of control. The numbers were just too large. They were in fire. The universe was too large and too difficult to focus upon meaningful single events in the progression of the development timeline of the public health crisis and its migration. At that point, with folks flooding into hospitals, worrying about losing available hospital beds, developing vaccines, trying to prevent from getting infected or dying, trying to figure out if people should be wearing masks or not, the sense of urgency tends to cause the investigative process to fall on the back burner. Why? Because you're looking at the fire that's burning, while everyone feeds to panic and pandemonium and desperation. So nobody is going back to do that, Robert De Niro job, that Steve Baldwin job, the detective work. And unfortunately, even though in the very beginning, some very disciplined behavior was occurring near the beginning, after doctors began to notice that they had a little more than a few isolated incidents in China of what appeared to be a new pathogen, like employing epidemiologists, the infectious disease control experts, to dispatch in teams of at least 5 epidemiologists, a total of 1,800 teams to perform critical tasks, investigative tasks, detective tasks, like following up on tracer contacts, but which began quickly to suffer a mission creep after doctors hit a panic button to alert the World Health Authorities. But they had a pretty clear as mud picture of where the outbreak appeared to have originated, the Hunan wholesale seafood market. It was a wet market, which was eventually closed, along with many others, for an extended period of time, because there had been a history of communicable disease outbreaks arising from wet markets in China. So it kind of made sense. And the idea of people getting infected by animals sounded like a possibility because it had happened before in the past. Sick animals give people diseases. It happens. You might get fleas from your dog. But the only problem was that it was too large, the venue, the size of 9 American football fields, where they found only a total of 27 people infected, mostly vendors, and most pretty much related to the same families. A little odd. Vendors should be spreading a contagious disease to their customers, but it did not happen. 27 people in a busy market bumping into people, especially in China where everything is crowded, should have been giving it to other people, but it didn't happen. And although people were developing cases of pneumonia, at that point nobody was dying. But the news train had left the station, and everyone was sent into a panic all over the world about a raging conflagration in China, even though the evidence clearly demonstrated something very, very different from the picture that we saw in the news. By January 14th, some epidemiologists actually speculated that, looking at the actual evidence, that it was a family disease. But we didn't hear that science report on the news. Why? Because the fire was raging in the news. It was being fed. It had kindling. It had fuel. It was burning the fires of the pandemic in terms of a news story, but very, very contrary to the facts. By February 24th, teams of up to 5 epidemiologists trained in examining disease, even while the fires of contagion were raging in the press, made a significant finding. More surprising than the preliminary findings about the families, examining over 55,000 laboratory-confirmed cases in China. Focusing on the origins, these scientists were still convinced that families appeared to be the primary persons afire with infections. But more significantly was the findings among close tracer contacts in these families. Remember that these are families who resided in close quarters with frequent interpersonal contact, hugging, kissing, doing the things that families do for extended periods, not just casual contact at a market and a church or on the street. They still found that only 5 in 100 were passing the infection to one of their close personal contacts, a secondary attack rate of less than 5%. And even if you don't know that a communicable disease being transmitted from person to person should find a secondary attack rate of at least 20%, it still has to sound like common sense to conclude that less than 5% is pretty low, and certainly not highly contagious. It's not a conflagration burning out of control. It's like taking a match and trying to set a tree on fire. It just wasn't happening. It didn't have the bandwidth. Now, scientists know that biological weapons are always deployed surreptitiously, by surprise, to give an aggressor a first strike capability, combined with the element of surprise because of plausible deniability. Hey, I got hit. It wasn't me. Hey, I got hit. It wasn't me. And scientists know, like a fire investigator who has to determine if it was a fire caused by an arson and not some natural occurrence or accident like faulty wiring, that he has to first make it pretty certain that the cause was not man-made and not an act of nature. But in April, knowing that COVID-19 on the clinical evidence did not appear like a communicable disease, being transmitted from person to person, yet it's still Christian Andersen, just like Hans Christian Andersen, the emperor that had no clothes, the Little Mermaid, the Ugly Duckling, at the Scripps Research Center published a report not to disprove that COVID-19 was not a biological weapon manufactured in a lab or whatever, but rather that it was a zoonotic evolution, that it was a zoonotic evolution. What's wrong with that approach? First, Andersen was proceeding in the wrong direction, starting with the conclusion that it was a zoonotic evolution and then trying to prove that rather than trying to disprove that it was a biologic weapon. But there's another big reason. Very, very big reason. Have you ever tried to start a campfire? Did you notice that you just can't throw a log on the fireplace and toss in a match? You can't even get the fire going on your barbecue pit without a little lighter fluid and kindling. And then say, hey, there's a fire. And then what happens? You have this big gigantic fire and it just kind of burns out. Why? Because you haven't heated the coals sufficiently. Researchers say that even when the planes hit the towers on 9/11, even with all of that hot burning jet fuel, there would have been just a huge fireball that would have pretty quickly burned itself out, unless it had something combustible to ignite to keep the fire going. And we all remember the white pieces of paper flowing down from the towers. And this is just like the zoonotic evolution for a less than 5% infectious pathogen like COVID-19. If by chance a bat or even multiple bats, like some have speculated, or other animals had managed to infect 27 vendors at the Hunan wholesale seafood market, a less than 5% infectious pathogen is not likely to set off a raging inferno. Fire would peter out. And at the market, it certainly did not erupt into a conflagration, an inferno, a 5-alarm fire. But in the press, the fires of pandemic were already raging out of control, painting a totally different picture, that the world was going to end by fire. A totally different picture from what the clinical evidence said. So Dr. Fauci, Dr. Northam, Dr. Oliver, Dr. Lewinsky, Dr. Biden, did you see the movie Backdraft? Remember that great line by Stephen Baldwin to the politician? You see that bright flash in the corner of your eye? That's your career dissipation line. And it just went into overdrive.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.